And so over time, the more and more I talked about it, the more sort of normal it became.
This is Caregiver Storyteller, produced by CaringKind, the heart of Alzheimer's caregiving. Hi everyone, and welcome to Caregiver Storyteller, a storytelling podcast about Alzheimer's and dementia caregiving. I'm Chris Doucette, and I'll be interviewing caregivers to get their stories about Alzheimer's and dementia caregiving. Occasionally, I'll also interview the authors, advocates, researchers, healthcare professionals, and people with Alzheimer's and dementia to hear their stories too. So, are you ready? Here we go. Hey listeners, Chris Doucette here again with a brief message before we begin the show. If you've ever dreamt about running the New York City Marathon, now's your chance. CaringKind is an official charity partner with the New York City Marathon, and we're assembling a 35-person team to run on November 3rd. We only have a few entries left, so if you, or someone you know, wants to run the greatest race in the world while also raising money for a worthy cause, please visit our marathon website at caringkindnyc.org/athletes. And if you're loving this podcast, you can always donate to show your support at caringkindnyc.org/podcast. Okay, thanks. On to the show.
So my name is Jordana, and I live in northern New Jersey. I'm a relatively new resident there, and my relationship to Alzheimer's is that my mother was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's around the age of 61.
And how did that come about? What was the day like?
It wasn't really, you kind of know, it wasn't really any different from any other day. I feel like we saw different signs. We took her to her primary care physician, my dad made an appointment with a neurologist, and then you just kind of wait and go for the appointment, and then everything is sort of, inconclusive, right? It's just sort of some kind of MCI or like mild cognitive impairment at that point in time, and you know what that means. Her mother had Alzheimer's, so it's just sort of a matter of time for the disease to progress.
And how did your mom react to her own diagnosis?
I don't know. We never talked about it. It was never a topic of conversation. I had just graduated from college at the time, so I just moved home, and it was never a part of a conversation.
It just became the new normal.
Yeah, that was just sort of life.
Mm-hmm. Does that, looking back on it now, does that feel weird to you, or does that feel like, no, that's just how my family operates?
Yeah, sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. I think you see, I've watched Still Alice recently for the second or third time, I don't remember, and you see how they talk about the disease and how they have conversations around progress and how she's feeling and what she feels like and what she's thinking, and there's a lot of open dialogue. I've also listened to some of these podcasts where people say it's just never mentioned, or it's just different types of conversations around it. And I don't think there's anything that's right or wrong. It's just the way that we handled it. I just moved back home from college, but I had just also moved out of my parents' house at that point in time. Mm-hmm. So I was living on my own, but I was still living in the same town. So I think, there were these things that we would notice that just seemed off. And when you look back and you have the ability to put all of those together, yes, it seems very, very obvious. But when you're living with it in the moment, they're just sort of frustrating. I'd be looking, because I just had moved into my own place, we were looking for furniture, and my mom would repeatedly encourage us to go to this furniture place in this town that had closed. And so she would suggest it and we would say it closed, and she would suggest it and we would say it closed. And so it was that kind of repeat conversation, which is very, very traditionally symptomatic of early stages of Alzheimer's.
Right. And how did your dad respond to that? I mean, did he get frustrated, or did he have some unlimited patience? Like, where on the spectrum was he?
If he ever listens to this, but my dad certainly does not have unlimited patience.
Also not unusual.
I would say my dad does not have unlimited patience, typically, let alone for things like that. But in general, I think, especially once you then have patience. I think at the time you kind of think, like, gosh, we just told you this. It's already, it closed. We told you that 15 minutes ago, or we told you that yesterday, or, that's when you sort of start to think to yourself, well, I've been saying that a lot recently, or I've been repeating myself a lot recently. And I think in the moment you don't have patience because you think, why aren't you remembering? But once you have the diagnosis and you have the understanding, your entire mentality and world sort of shifts.
Right. And did you get any help to shift your own mentality or your own approach with that from support groups or educations or trainings or anything like that?
Yeah, so I cheat a little bit because my undergraduate degree is in therapeutic recreation and psychology. So no, I have the ability to really separate the emotion from it and think about what needs to be done from a very practical standpoint. Yes, it's definitely emotional when it's your mother, and I'm an only child, and a lot of I feel like a lot of the responsibility falls on me and my father, and it does, but also I don't have anybody to share that with when it comes to your parents. So we did try my dad and I went to one support group. It's like, a Wednesday late afternoon. I remember either leaving work early or working from home. I don't remember, but we went there, and it was, a young woman leading the support group at a long-term care facility. And my mom, this was in the early stages, and I remember in the room there being myself, my father, and then all of these women probably in their mid to late 70s whose husbands had Alzheimer's, and all they were doing was just really bitching about it just wasn't necessarily a support group. They were more bitching about their care, and I was like, oh God, part of being in a support group is being able to relate, and I think we didn't have that ability. And you should always try things 3 times. So if you're listening and you have the same experience, don't do what we did, but we didn't go back.
Good advice. Yeah.
But I remember that vividly. It was very funny. We walked out of there and we just laughed, which isn't nice either, but.
Well, if that's your experience, that's what it is. What you have a degree with a background in this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. What did and then you tried a support group, but what did your dad do? Does he have any kind of health degree or background? And after the support group, what did he do?
Yeah, so he does not. His degree is in statistics and mathematics, and I don't know. We don't really talk about it. We still don't.
Yeah. So it sounds like he just kind of muscled his way through and did what needed to be done. Yeah, and I think that he's really her advocate, and he's very involved in her care, and I think has really developed relationships with people in her care during this time. So I think that's also very helpful to him. As far as being that advocate, being very involved, I think that's his way of handling it. Right. There's some sense in a powerless situation, it's a way to exert some kind of control, right? To be a stellar caregiver, I suppose. Yeah. What did, was he relieved by a diagnosis? Because as her husband, he should have, he was probably aware that something was going wrong and probably didn't have an idea of what it was. And did the diagnosis at least put into context her behavior? Or did he not express that in any way?
He didn't express that in any way, and we didn't really. You probably saw the expression on my face. But
we need to get him in here somehow.
I haven't even told him I'm here. So, I don't know. I'm not really sure.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And you said your mom was diagnosed at 61, and how many years ago was that?
This will be 10 years.
10 years.
Yeah.
And has she been living at home this entire time? Is she in a nursing facility at this point? How is she doing now?
Yeah, so my math is definitely wrong, but it's something around those numbers.
No one's going to hold you accountable to this.
I believe it was 2009, something like that. So this is 10 years, but I feel like I'm not doing the math in my head, and she's not 71, but close to it.
Okay.
So she was at home until the fall of 2016, and then she went into a care facility, and she's been there since, and she's been on hospice since June or July of this year also.
Oh, wow. So hospice for the past like 10 years, 10 months.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how was the transition from home to a nursing facility? And then how was from nursing facility to hospice?
So it worked out well. The transition was just that, you're going to go here. It's going to be a bit like a vacation. You're going to make some new friends. And she never fought. She never put up a battle. She was always very amicable throughout the entire process. 90% of the time, 95% of the time. I remember one incident where she was arguing with me, but in general, through all of the transitions, no, she was just very agreeable to everything.
That's wonderful, because it's not always like that, right?
I know.
Yeah.
And I hear these, stories where just the behavior is so out of character or, violent and aggressive. And it just makes you wonder, why is she so easygoing about everything? I don't know.
Well, that's a good kind of departure point for, what was she like before the diagnosis? What is her name, by the way? What's
Betty.
Betty.
Yeah.
So what was Betty like, as a mom growing up?
Yeah. Well, I remember us talking about this a bit last time, but I mean, she's been sick for now about a third of my life. Mm-hmm. So the last time I was at home really for an extended period of time, I was 18. And then she was sick when I got home from college. So from that perspective, I have more of a juvenile relationship with what my mother was like in my life. Mm-hmm. She was a good mother. She was always there. She took me to gymnastics practice, and dinner was ready, and she drove me to go to the movies or to see my friends, but that's what I remember my mom as. I don't have this...
as a mom more than a person,
right? Yeah. I just look at her. I see her as a mom, as a parent, versus the relationship that I have with my father now. As an adult, your relationship with your parents are so different.
Right. And you see them as different. You see them as just individuals with all their flaws and their strengths and everything.
Yeah.
What was she like? I mean, was she artistic? Was she mathematical like your dad?
Definitely not mathematical like my dad. They met at Rutgers while she was working on her master's thesis, and she needed help with computers and doing the statistical analysis for her master's thesis. And so she was introduced to my father then. And actually, they both have their PhD, and I only recently learned that they met doing their master's, not during their PhD.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I learned that probably 2018. That was new information.
Wow, surprise.
Yeah, I had no idea. But
with so many degrees, it's hard to keep track.
Definitely not mathematical. She majored in English and literature, and she graduated with a teaching degree and was a reading specialist for a while. So not mathematical, but artistic. Definitely didn't draw. She liked to knit, I remember, a lot. Sew. She was very good at sewing, taught me how to sew. We used to make doll clothes growing up for my American Girl doll. We bought the patterns, and we would go out and buy the fabric and then sew the dresses together. I have her sewing machine, which is really fun. I haven't used it yet. Apartment living isn't really conducive to that.
No, not at all.
When I have a house, I will. But again, it's sort of that juvenile, like that child parent. I know that she really loved talking to her sister on the weekends. They talked, probably once a week on the phone. But I don't really know a lot about her.
Have you learned more about her from conversations with your dad, or have you talked to your aunt about her? Do you hear stories like secondhand?
No. Is that bad?
No,
I mean, I probably should. No, not really.
I have cousins I've never met, so totally, I don't think it's odd at all.
Very little, really. Yeah, no.
Interesting. Yeah. It sounds like your dad took on the burden of caregiving,
yes,
right?
Absolutely.
And I presume that he was working during this time. So how did he balance caregiving and work?
Yeah, so he wasn't. He retired young at 58. So he had retired and then sort of retired to a lot of volunteer work and teaching at a university teaching statistics at a university part-time. So he, he was home with her a lot. And then when she couldn't be left alone, they actually, at my mom's suggestion many, many years ago, and I don't remember any of this. I oddly remember the man in our house, but they got long-term care insurance. So I remember the two of them and this man sitting at their dining room table filling out all the paperwork. So once my mom couldn't be left alone anymore, they were able to get a caregiver in the house, or a companion in the house per se, to just supervise her. And then after, when that wasn't enough, that was when we really decided to move her to a care facility.
And was that weird for you to have another person in the house?
Well, at that time, I was living abroad.
Oh, okay.
So I was not even local.
Right.
Was it probably not weird for my dad, because the person wasn't usually there when he was there. When he was home, he was able to care for her, at least keep an eye out for her. And, she wasn't per se wandering off on her own just randomly, especially when he was home. So that wasn't really, an issue.
Right.
Or intentionally trying to, escape and run away.
Yeah.
So when he was home, she didn't need eyes on her all the time, but she was fine.
Right. And how was the experience for you, like, emotionally? Like, she got sick as you kind of were away, and but she wasn't, she was still pretty high functioning after her initial diagnosis. Yeah. So it's kind of like, it's the long goodbye, right? It's a long illness. Yeah. And so emotionally, what was that like for you? Do you, like, where were you before? Where are you now? Yeah. How do you process that? Does it change over the time?
It definitely changes. And for a long time, I didn't talk about it. I didn't share it with anyone. I would go to work and nobody knew. I was also at a point in time where I didn't have, my mom was at a point in time where I didn't have to let people know, because there wasn't the potential for me to have to leave. And then I think as the disease progressed, that was really when I needed to be more open about it. I needed to share with at least my manager that I have a mother who has early onset Alzheimer's and she's still at home, and things have happened, and there have been times where I've needed to kind of drop everything and go home and help my father out, and so over time, the more and more I talked about it, the more sort of normal it became. I think now, and God, I know I'm sure that there are going to be some people listening to this who are going to think that I'm absolutely crazy, but it gets to a point where you think, like, enough is enough. Like, she has not had a quality of life for probably more than a year now. She's been on hospice for about 10 months. And so now I just kind of think, like, why does somebody have to live like this? Why is this something that's okay? And for me, I follow and I read a lot about, assisted, call it what you will, assisted dying, assisted suicide, assisted, ending your life at your own will, and call it whatever you will, right? And it's very, sort of progressive outside of the United States, and it's obviously very controversial, but I follow a lot of that because I think, why wouldn't she have had the choice? Like, I certainly want to have the choice. I don't want to end up like that. I don't want to live my life like that, because that's not a life worth living. And I don't want to put my family through that. I don't want my children, if that's me, I don't want my children to have to experience and feel what I felt. And I think it's a really hard topic for people to talk about. And I have no issue talking about it. I don't know, maybe it's just based on my experience, or it's something that my family has always been very forthcoming about. Jordana, here is all of the information that you need. If I pass first, this is what you need to do. This is who you need to contact, and these are the consequences if mom passes first, and then I pass shortly after. Here's still what you need to do. This is who you have to contact. Here are all my passwords. This is the account information, and go take care of it. And it's a very sort of unemotional, very practical approach to something that's going to happen to every single one of us. But yet it's a very difficult topic for some people. And I think you may as well talk about it. You may as well make that process as easy as possible for your survivors. You hear people who don't have a will, and I just think maybe you don't want to talk about it, but unfortunately the consequence is that your next of kin are then going to need to deal with it, and it's going to be such a hassle for them while they're also dealing with their grief, versus just having some kind of information laid out and make their process as painless as possible. But people can make their own choices.
How do you feel? Does your father also follow this kind of train of logic with you? And does he feel at all burdened by, what decision should he make and how should he make it?
No, because that's always been outlined from day one.
Oh, good. Yeah.
They have had, and that's the other thing, they have had wills probably, I don't know if they've had them before me, but as long as I can remember, they've always had a will, and they've always talked to me about what their wishes are and what they do want to have and don't want to have. And all of that is specified out in their directives, but it's always been documented. But they would talk, not only did they document it, they would talk to me about it. Yeah. And I think that made a big difference too.
Good. If your mom has been on hospice for 10 months, do her doctors have a prognosis of any kind? How long do they think she has to live?
I guess she doesn't go to the doctor anymore. They have the sort of doctor in the nursing home. I have no idea. Yeah. I'm not even really sure that would be a question that I would ask her.
Yeah. It's like cross the bridge when you get to it. Yeah. Has your dad voiced, is there any ever language like, after your mom passes, I've decided to do certain things, or is it really just living in the moment right now and worrying about crossing that bridge later?
Yeah. So we've briefly had short conversations about it, because he still lives in the house that we grew up in, 5-bedroom house in the suburbs with a half an acre of lawn that he loves to take care of but also he lives there with his dog and occasionally my dog. Yeah. So he doesn't need a house that big, but it's also close to where my mom is. Yeah. Do he and I have those conversations? No. I think I secretly hope that he will eventually sell the house and then move out to the beach or move somewhere that, he would enjoy doing activities, or, maybe down to LBI, but he also likes to teach. So he'd need to kind of find some kind of location that's close to the things that he enjoys and can also have the life of his own that he wants to have. But we don't talk about that a whole lot, but eventually he'll sell the house.
Yeah. We're actually wrapping up in just a minute. But before we do, if you were to meet someone who is currently going through the caregiving experience, what advice would you have to give them?
I have a couple bits of advice. I think the first is you need to have, as soon as you get the diagnosis, you need to have a plan. So my dad and I really took the time to decide, what is our plan going to be? When it's time to put her in a long-term care facility, where are we going to put her? And so we drove around New Jersey and we visited a number of different places, and then ultimately we made the decision. And I think being able to do that when you don't need it is a really important thing to be able to do, because you approach it and you look at the location with not only a more critical eye, but you have an awareness of, what's good versus what's bad, as opposed to some kind of desperation. I think the other bit of advice too is one of the things my dad would always say to me when I would talk to him about, I think it's time to move her into a nursing home, was just around, well, I don't think it's time. And this was sort of where I used my education versus, well, how do you know when it is time? A lot of times people don't know when it's time until something happens. And I think it's usually some kind of event or some kind of whatever it might be. For us, it was she had wandered off and was found 12 miles down the road in the New Brunswick train station, bus depot with the dog. She'd taken the dog out for a walk and got lost. And I think, it's those are the events that you want to try to avoid to happen. So you want to kind of make decisions ahead of when they're actually necessary, because you're never really going to know when it's time to make a decision or to pass a certain milestone unless there's something specific that happens, and you want to avoid getting to that point. And the other thing too is you need to have a life of your own. And I think it's being a caregiver 24/7 does not allow you to be able to do that. And I think it's important to make sure that you focus on self-care in some way, that you have the time to do that. You think about yourself, what's important for you, and not just the individual who you're caring for.
Self-care, always a good idea.
Yes, it is.
Jordana, thank you so much for telling your story.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to share your story, go to caringkindnyc.org/podcast. Maybe we'll use your story on the show. We'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to this podcast and leave some glowing feedback. We love positive reinforcement. I'm Chris Doucette, and you're listening to Caregiver Storyteller, produced by CaringKind, the heart of Alzheimer's caregiving.